There is a man who sat down one afternoon and made a list, not a list of how to get rich, a list of how to guarantee, with almost mathematical certainty, that a person would end up broke, bitter, and unhappy. He did this on purpose because he believed the fastest way to understand success was to study failure first and then simply refuse to walk into it. That man was Charlie Munger, and the list he made is more useful than almost anything written about money in the last 100 years. Most people who end up poor didn't fall into it by accident. They walked in one small decision at a time, following a pattern so common that Munger could practically recite it from memory. Once you see the pattern, you notice it everywhere, in your own habits, in your family, in people you admire if you're honest with yourself about them. This isn't a video about budgeting apps or coupon tips. Munger spent decades trying to figure out why smart, capable, hardworking people still end up with nothing, and his answer was rarely bad luck or a bad economy. It was almost always the thinking. Stay with this one, because by the end you'll probably recognize at least one of these traps sitting in your own life right now. Munger was Warren Buffett's business partner for over 5 decades, and in a lot of ways the sharper edge of the two. Buffett has said publicly that Munger pushed him past just buying cheap stocks and taught him to pay a fair price for a genuinely good business instead. But Munger's real gift wasn't picking stocks. It was a habit of mind he borrowed from mathematicians and engineers and applied to ordinary life inversion. Instead of asking, how do I succeed, he asked, how do I fail, and then spent his energy avoiding that path. He once said all he wanted to know was where he was going to die, so he could just never go there. It sounds like a joke the first time you hear it. It isn't. It's a whole philosophy folded into one sentence. So let's invert poverty the same way. Not the poverty someone is born into, since nobody picks their starting line. We're talking about the self-inflicted kind, built from decisions and blind spots that are entirely within a person's control. Munger named these traps bluntly, and once you understand them, avoiding most of them is almost mechanical. Start with debt, since it's the one people push back on hardest. Munger was famously wary of leverage, of borrowed money used to chase a bigger return or a bigger lifestyle. He watched genuinely brilliant people get wiped out, not because their ideas were wrong, but because debt turned one small mistake into a fatal one. And it wasn't caution for caution's sake. He'd done the math. Borrow to buy something, and you're not just betting on the thing itself. You're betting nothing unexpected happens before you can pay it back. Something unexpected always happens eventually, whether it's a job loss, a medical bill, or a crash nobody saw coming. Debt removes your margin for error right when life decides to test you. The people who stayed rich almost always kept enough cash and flexibility that bad news never forced their hand. The people who fell, or who never climbed out in the first place, were usually leveraged into a corner with no room to breathe. That reframes the whole conversation about money. It's less about how much you make and more about how much room you leave yourself. Someone earning a modest income who never borrows past their means, who keeps a cushion and says no to the tempting car loan, is structurally safer than someone earning triple that who's leveraged to the edge of every paycheck. Munger wasn't saying debt is evil. Used with discipline in a business with predictable cash flow, it's a tool. Used to fund a lifestyle or keep up appearances, it's a slow trap that feels like nothing until it's suddenly everything at once. The second trap is quieter and in a way more dangerous because it never feels like a mistake while you're making and learning only from your own experience and ignoring everyone else's. Munger read constantly biographies, obituaries, scientific papers, because he understood something most people never fully accept. Nobody lives long enough to personally survive every mistake that can ruin a life. If you insist on learning it all the hard way, you run out of time before you run out of lessons. The people who kept ending up broke usually shared a strange stubbornness. They needed to touch the stove themselves, even after watching someone else get burned. Think about how many financial disasters you've personally watched happen to someone else. A friend who went all in without a backup plan, a relative who signed a loan for someone unreliable. Did you file that away, or did some quiet part of you think that won't happen to me? Munger would say that sentence is one of the most expensive in the language. The third trap is quitting too early, and it cuts against a story we love telling ourselves. We hear about the overnight success. We rarely hear about the version where the person quit 6 months before it would have worked. Munger thought a lot of financial failure came from giving up on a good idea right before compounding started paying off. And compounding, to him, wasn't just a financial mechanism. It was closer to a law of the universe. Skills compound. Reputation compounds. The early returns always look unimpressive. almost not worth the effort, and it's only later that the curve bends in a way that looks, from the outside, like magic. People who quit during the flat part never see the bend, so they conclude the whole thing doesn't work, when really they just left before the third act. That's why Munger treated patience as close to a moral virtue rather than just a strategy. He and Buffett became known for sitting on piles of cash for years, doing nothing, while other investors mocked them for missing out. Then a crisis would hit, everyone else would be desperate to sell. And Munger and Buffett were the ones with dry powder and calm nerves. Patience isn't passive, it's stored power. Whoever can wait has leverage over whoever can't. Here's one of Munger's sharper observations, and it points somewhere most of us would rather not look: envy. He once said, half joking, that it wasn't greed running the world, it was envy. Think about how much financial damage happens quietly because someone is trying to keep pace with a life that isn't theirs. The car bought because a neighbor bought one. The vacation charged to a card for the photo rather than the trip. The house stretched past comfortable because a siblings look nicer. Envy rarely announces itself as envy. It shows up dressed as ambition or taste, as simply deserving nice things, while underneath it's a comparison engine quietly draining a bank account to keep pace with a race nobody agreed to enter. Munger's answer wasn't to live like a monk. It was simpler than that, and honestly more freeing. Stop measuring your life against someone else's highlight reel. Every visible symbol of wealth you see in someone's life is one frame pulled from a much longer film you haven't watched. You don't see the debt behind it, or the stress, or the version that exists off camera. Chasing an image built from other people's curated moments is one of the fastest ways to spend money you don't have on things you don't need to impress people who, honestly, aren't paying that much attention to you anyway. There's a subtler pattern Munger pointed to, one that feels more like a personality quirk than a financial decision. Unreliability, being the person who's late, who cancels, who half finishes things, who says yes without meaning it. Munger argued that reliability is one of the most underrated forms of capital a person can build because business runs on trust, and every deal or partnership or second chance is a bet someone makes on whether you'll follow through. Unreliable people, even brilliant ones, slowly get cut out. Not out of spite, it's just that nobody hands anything important to a person they can't count on. Over a lifetime, that quietly closes doors, and in its own way, it becomes a kind of poverty too, just of opportunity instead of money. Which brings us to something Munger cared about more than almost anything. Staying inside your circle of competence. Know what you actually understand, and know, with real honesty, what you don't. There's a graveyard full of people who were brilliant in one field and assumed that expertise carried over automatically into investing or some unrelated venture. A great surgeon isn't automatically a great investor. A successful business owner in one industry isn't automatically equipped to gamble on a different one. Munger would rather admit he didn't understand something and walk away from an opportunity that looked obvious to everyone else than pretend expertise he didn't have. That single habit, saying, "I don't know," and meaning it, has probably protected more fortunes than any clever strategy ever built one. Munger didn't just avoid ignorance passively, though. He went after it. He described himself and Buffett as learning machines, people who went to bed a little wiser than they woke up every day for decades. It wasn't about collecting trivia. It was building what he called a lattice work of mental models, borrowing ideas from psychology, biology, physics, and history, and using them together to see a situation more clearly than someone looking through a single lens. Most financial mistakes, in his view, didn't come from a lack of intelligence. They came from a narrow frame, looking at a decision through one discipline or one emotion and missing the bigger picture a wider set of tools would have shown. That connects to a lecture Munger gave on human misjudgment, where he laid out the psychological tendencies that quietly sabotage rational decisions. The tendency to justify a past decision instead of admitting it was wrong. The tendency to overweight a vivid, recent story over boring, reliable data. The tendency to follow a crowd simply because it's there. Most people don't fail financially for lack of information, since information is nearly free now. They fail because their own psychology distorts how they use it. They hold on to a losing investment because admitting the mistake feels worse than losing more money. They chase a trend because everyone around them is chasing it, and being wrong alone feels scarier than being wrong in a group. Munger's fix for most of this was an almost uncomfortable level of self-honesty. Actively look for evidence you're wrong, not just evidence that confirms you're right. Most people build a case for a decision after the fact and call it reasoning. Real reasoning, the kind he practiced, Means trying to break your own argument before reality does it for you. Then there's incentives, maybe the single idea he returned to more than any other. He believed incentives shaped human behavior more than intelligence, more than good intentions, more than moral character in a lot of cases. Show him the incentive, he said, and he'd show you the outcome. That matters for anyone trying to stay out of poverty, because it means paying less attention to what people say and more to what they're actually rewarded for. The salesperson recommending a product is usually paid by commission, not by what's best for you. The friend pitching a business opportunity may be rewarded for recruiting you, not for your success. Even your own decisions get bent by incentives you barely notice, like wanting to look successful in front of others even at real cost. Understanding incentives, other people's and your own, tells you a lot about what's really driving a deal underneath what's being said out loud. All of this connects because Munger never thought in scattered tips. Debt removes your margin for error. Refusing to learn from others means paying for the same lesson twice. Quitting early kills compounding before it pays off. Envy drains money chasing an illusion. Unreliability closes doors quietly over time. Operating outside your circle of competence turns confidence into a liability. Ignoring incentives blinds you to what's actually driving the people around you. None of these traps need bad luck. A person could avoid every one of them and still hit hardship from something outside their control, but fall into all of them, and poverty becomes close to guaranteed no matter how much money passes through your hands, because the leak was never in the income. It was in the thinking. That's the part of Munger's philosophy people find hardest to sit with, and also, if they're honest, the most freeing. Harder to sit with because it puts less blame on circumstances than most of us would like. Freeing because it means more is within reach than we've been told. Nobody controls the market or interest rates or the next crisis, but debt you take on, lessons you refuse to learn secondhand, an idea you quit on too soon. Envy steering your spending, whether people can rely on you, whether you're honest about what you actually know, whether you notice the incentive behind someone's advice, all of that sits squarely in your hands. There's a story that captures how Munger actually lived this out early in his career, before the wealth. Before the partnership with Buffett became legendary, he went through a genuinely brutal stretch, a painful divorce, the loss of a young son to leukemia, financial setbacks that would have justified almost anyone giving up. His response wasn't self-pity. It was almost eerily analytical. He treated hardship the way he treated a bad investment. Learn from it, adjust, keep moving without spending energy on resentment. He wasn't cold about it, and he felt the loss fully, but he refused to let pain become the excuse for a lifetime of bad decisions afterward. And that combination, feeling something completely while still thinking clearly about the next move, might be the harder skill underneath everything else here. Because avoiding poverty was never really about spreadsheets or interest rates or even income. It's about temperament. Whether you can watch a trend excite everyone around you and calmly say, I don't understand this well enough to risk money on it. Whether you can sit with a boring savings account for years while friends flaunt purchases funded by debt they'll regret. Whether you can absorb a real loss and still show up the next morning with clear judgment instead of a grudge. Munger built a philosophy of life around exactly that kind of temperament and gave it away for free through decades of interviews and letters and lectures. So where does that leave you right now? Somewhere in the last several minutes, one of these probably felt a little too familiar. Maybe the debt one, maybe envy, maybe a kind of unreliability you've never really looked at directly. That discomfort isn't an accident. It's the exact spot Munger would tell you to lean into instead of away from, because the people who end up poor rarely lack information about what went wrong. They lack the willingness to look at it while there's still time to change course. Munger died in late 2023, just shy of 100 years old. He never claimed to have all the answers, and he often said all he was really trying to do was be consistently not stupid rather than brilliant. Maybe that's the point worth keeping. You don't need a genius plan to avoid poverty. You mostly need to dodge a handful of predictable, well-documented traps that quietly ruin otherwise capable people, one habit at a time. Know what's actually inside your competence. Keep enough margin that bad luck alone can't finish you off. Borrow lessons from other people's failures instead of insisting on your own. Give compounding enough time to actually bend the curve. Notice when envy is the one spending your money. Be the person others can rely on. and pay closer attention to what people are rewarded for than to what they say. None of it guarantees wealth. Nothing does. But it tilts the odds hard enough that poverty stops being something that just happens to you and starts looking like something you'd have to actively choose, one decision at a time. If any of this made you look sideways at your own habits, that's worth sitting with instead of scrolling past. If you want more of this kind of thinking, consider subscribing. There's a lot more where it came from. Munger spent a lifetime trying to think a little more clearly than he had the day before, and that habit, at least, is free to borrow.